Hello. Um, so we have been on an adventure of painting landscapes together, or learning about the elements of painting a landscape. And we started back at the beginning with these super simple, just ground and sky landscapes, trying to achieve the illusion of depth on that flat sheet of paper, with the hope that this ground felt farther away from the other ground, clouds, no clouds. We then moved on to altering the color of the sky, right? So we have fancy sky sunrise or sunset, and we started talking about trees at the distance and stormy sky, more trees at the distance. This here has two levels, so if we're thinking in terms of landscape, right here in this landscape I have background and I have something that feels like middle ground, but out here in the front or the foreground I have nothing. It's pretty empty. So one thing that we can do, and then we've been practicing trees are easy to paint in the sense that they're very irregular out in nature, like they're different from each other, but a little bit tricky to paint too, because it's hard to kind of mimic all of their parts and have them feel realistic. And so hopefully you practice some trees. Today we're going to combine all of those elements by adding some trees back into a landscape that you've already painted. Because like we can even imagine here, like if I were to say, all right, I'm really happy with these trees, like trying to paint a sky, especially in here, because watercolor moves with water, these branches are going to leak and it will make the sky not be blue in between the branches anymore. And it would be really hard to do. So what we have to do when we're painting with watercolor is paint at least part of our landscape first. So today we're going to go back to these two landscapes that we painted to start with, and we are going to add trees into these. So what I'm going to do is think about at the very back. Remember we talked about trees at the very back are not distinctly green. They are sort of grayish or bluish green. And so you can see I mixed up some of my blue and my green that was just left over from painting my last landscape, and I mixed it over here in with a little bit of red. Red and green are complementary colors and they will kind of neutralize each other, so it makes the green duller or a little darker. And then I'm just going to add some water, and I'm going to come over here, and out here at the very far edge, I'm just going to add some simple, like trees when they're far away from you and in a group, don't look like much of anything. They just look like lumps. So I'm going to give my landscape some far in the distance lumpy trees back here. Far in the distance, lumpy trees. And I can break them apart like this too. And I'll show you a trick when I come back, and I'm going to make one section of that darker. So this little gap will make this look like these are farther away and these are closer to us. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of, I can see that my green isn't, or like my color isn't super dark anymore there. I have a little bit too much water. And so I'm just going to come back. It's a little transparent. I can see the ground but underneath or through. So I'm just coming back and just using that wet into wet idea, like how we painted the trees in the first place. And I'm just going to give this some darker area. If I don't like how this hard line looks, I can squeeze, clean my paintbrush out, squeeze it dry, and just sort of soften this edge a little down and into the grass. So I'm kind of integrating the color from those trees at the far distance out and into the grass. Um, the kind of tree, now I have to just let this dry a little bit. I'm going to show you kind of a fun trick for adding a tree now, because I have a background now and I have what will alter to make be our middle ground. I want a tree that's way right here, and it's going to go mostly off my paper. So what I'm going to do, this is a fun trick, is I'm going to take my sheet, I'm going to flip it over, and then I'm just going to use 2 scraps of paper that I just have sitting here. Let's see, this is just some notes from something, and a sheet, and I'm going to cover up the rest of my paper. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to paint. So it's a totally new tree technique from yesterday. I'll show you how to reuse the one from yesterday too, but this one is sort of a fresh, fun one. I need a lot of painty water for this, so I'm going to really pull together a lot of color up here. If you happen to have an old toothbrush, this works with an old toothbrush too, but I'm going to try to get my paintbrush as full as I can with this painty water. And here's the reason why I blocked this. I want to put leaves up top. So I'm going to splatter them. I'm going to splash the paint on here. And then after I've splashed the paint, so this gives me a really random like leaf coat. So after I've splashed some dots on here, you can see I'm gonna squash some of them. I can come back now and I can make a lighter green with my yellow. I can never keep a yellow nice. Try to get more water in there. And I can do the same thing. So I'm trying to splash my paintbrush. And now I'm just like doing the same thing I did before. I'm squashing those dots. Squashing the dots. And remember, we need sky holes. I'm going to leave more room at the bottom. All right, I think that looks pretty good. So, move my scrap paper out of the way and turn my landscape back over. And here's what you can see happened. I have put leaves in for a tree that's super, super close to us. And now what I'm going to do is mix up some of my brown with a little bit of purple and green and blue from over here. And I'm going to, this is still too wet. We're going to wait. That's what we're going to do. I can't add a tree through this. It will just leak everywhere, and I can see that that's super shiny and wet. We'll go back to that one. I'm going to add trees to this guy too. I'm going to start the same way, but I'm going to go ahead and add a little tree from yesterday. But I'm going to add the background trees first too. So I'm going to take some of my green, mix it over here with some red so that it gets dull. Too red. There we go. Just need it to be kind of not super green anymore. And I'm going to add those same kind of far in the distance trees, which are basically just like lumpies. But this time I'm not going to add them all the way across because I want to jump ahead to showing you how to add a tree from yesterday into this landscape. And if I put trees all the way across, these you have to do in layers. You have to stop and let them dry. And that's a really normal process in painting with watercolor, is that we don't do it all in one go. You paint on it one day, you let it dry and come back and paint on it again the next day. So this having to let it dry thing is super, super normal and part of the process of painting with watercolor. So don't feel like you're doing it wrong if you have to quit and come back to it later. That's just how watercolor works. You have to let the paint dry or everything just ends up a mess. So I'm going to add a tree like that in my head, like the bottom of it is here. And the trunk and then the leaves come this way. So I'm going to start just like I did before. And I'm going to start with some yellow. And I'm going to give my tree some yellow highlights. And then you'll just see the different effect. And then I want you to try both types of tree on backgrounds that you guys have. And you can go ahead and use all the backgrounds that you have and add trees into them. The other thing that you can go ahead and do is you can paint new backgrounds if you want on one of the little like postcard size. So you can see I've painted a sky on this one. It's still drying. So that's something that I can do. But you have 4 backgrounds already painted from the practice that we've done. The one thing you do want to make sure is while you're adding trees to like the sunrise or the sunset or the stormy, that you keep with those same colors that you did in the sky. Remember, the sky controls the light, so the sky controls the color. I have done a bad job of skipping sky holes on this tree. Give it a big sky hole right there. You will find that you might have to go back and add a little more paint. Oh, that's ridiculous green. To get it to cover the background sometimes. So here are my like shadow colors. Giving it just a little bit more blue. Kind of a crooked tree. But trees aren't really straight. So it's fine. Okay. So you can see I have a leafy cluster here now that will become a tree. I do have to let that dry so that I can add in the branches and the trunk. So I'm going to switch back to this first landscape, and it looks like it is dry enough for me to do the next couple things. So remember, we were going to add a tree. I want the tree on this landscape to either go all the way off the paper, which is a possibility, or maybe to stop right here in this little bit of grassy place that I seem to have. And what I'm going to do, I'm going back to this like gray brown kind of color, and I'm going to use my paintbrush wide, and I'm going to start, actually it might be easier upside down. I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to give my tree a tree trunk. And I'm going to start with fairly light paint, and I will go back and darken it. And this trunk is going to go all the way up. And notice I've switched. I started with my paintbrush this way so that my trunk was a little wider down here. And now I have switched, and I'm switching as I move up because I need the branches on my tree to get a little smaller. And I've switched, and I'm using my paintbrush side to side. And as I move up, I'm also not pressing on it as hard. And that's how I'm going to get these tiny branches. And you'll see that I'm just going to branch those branches as I travel up the trunk. And if I feel like I don't have enough paint, I can come back, get more paint. And some of the leaves I'm stopping at, and some of the leaves I'm painting over. And what that does is it gives me the feeling of leaves in front of and behind my branches, which would be normal on a tree. Trying to make sure I can also overlap branches So you can see those branches just went over the branches from before, because trees have a lot of overlapping parts. They really do. And now it's just for me to come back and refine this. You can see that this looks like a really large tree at the very front of this landscape. I can come back and add a little bit more of this little bit darker color. I can decide which side of my tree is the shadowy side, and I can come back and I can make that side a little bit darker so that my tree sort of feels like it has a shadow side, which is normal, like light comes and hits objects on one side. So you can see I'm adding the darker on this half, and it's gonna like just wet into wet mix into the other part of the paint. If I feel like some of my branches are too light or too transparent, I can come back and I can add in a little bit more of this darker color. I don't need all of them to be super dark. It's sort of normal for us to see some of the branches in a tree and not others. And I like to start light like that because if I need to make changes, I can come back and I can make some changes in the branches because they're super light to start with. So there you go. Little tree. The one extra thing now that I can do is down here in the grass, there would be a shadow. And so I have some darker, kind of a blue-green mixed up, and I didn't clean my paintbrush, so I still have a little bit of the gray. And I'm just gonna put some of that down here in patches because the sun will shine through the leaves of a tree. But this will help my tree feel like it's attached to the ground here. Like I said, I'm not going to do it everywhere. I don't need the whole bottom of my painting to get dark, but I'm going to let some sun dapple show through. And I'm going to go past back here. I just have my tree feel a little like it's attached to the ground. And I can go back and I can adjust the branches if I want, or I can adjust the leaves if I want. But you see now I've taken that, what was just the plain ground and sky, and I have added a background, a middle ground, and a foreground, a great big tree. And it starts to feel like more complete in terms of a landscape painting. All right, back to this guy. Gonna do the same thing. Trunk. Little bit of my purple, a little bit of my brown. Gonna mix that in with some of my blue-green so that I have a grayish kind of color. You'll notice that I very rarely use black. Black in a landscape will look really kind of garish and too dark. Also notice that my tree trunk is not brown out of here, because if you look out your window and look at your trees, they're not brown either. This is still really wet for me up top, and so I am going to try to not bump that because I will just make a mess. And I'm using my paintbrush sideways here, and I'm just building my branches so that they make sense. I have kind of too many, I think, but it's too late now. And I'm putting a tree here in this landscape. Putting some branches up here in my sky holes. I already don't like this one, but that's a normal part of making paintings sometimes. You make one that you're just not a huge fan of. Just keep going. Not the end of the world. It's just a little painting. For this guy, I don't want it to go all the way off the paper. And what I'm going to do then is just sort of stop my trunk here. I've left the bottom kind of jagged so that I kind of have a feeling of maybe grass at the bottom. And then I can do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to come back. I'm going to get a little bit darker version of this color. And I'm going to put it on one of the sides and let the paint mix together so that I have that sensation of some darker, shadowy portions of my tree. And I need to do a section of branches up here, but I think that this is too wet still. Yes, it's definitely too wet still. So if I put branches over a really wet section of tree, you can see here that they're just leaking everywhere. So I still have too much of a puddle. I need to wait for some of this still to dry. So make sure that your the parts from the layer before are dry before you move on. I'm going to do the same thing here as I did on the other one, and I'm going to give my tree a bit of a shadow. So I'm going to use some blue green. I'm going to make sure that my shadow is as big as my tree. So leaf, line, shadow. And that will go right off my paper over on this side. Being careful not to touch the trunk right now just because I know it's really wet and I will make a really big mess. And there we go. We have added trees into our landscapes. Go ahead, have fun building trees into the landscapes you've already painted. Make sure you're letting layers dry in between, okay? Just the ground and sky is fairly quick to paint, letting that dry in between. Adding the trees, you do have to wait. I have to wait until the leaves dry before I put my trunk on. I have to wait for a background to dry before I try to add trees. I would say that that's the biggest mistake. You can't rush through it. It's going to take you probably a couple of days to finish one of these, making sure that you're letting elements dry in between layers. Once you've practiced adding trees into the backgrounds that you already have, you can give it a go all in one and make a landscape from start to finish on one of your little postcards. So you can go ahead and paint a sky and then paint a ground, wait for that to dry, and then you can add trees. We will continue landscapes next week. We will make some landscapes that have a little bit more trees, a little bit of forest. We will add in buildings and water, and so our landscape adventures will continue. But this way you get to combine the trees that we've worked on painting into the landscapes you've already painted. Have fun.